The cosmological argument and the design argument, both of which we're going to be looking at this week, are two of the most famous among the so-called philosophical proofs for God's existence. And philosophers typically have looked at the question of religion from within the standpoint of what's called natural reason, and we'll talk about what that means and what that is in a second. The cosmological and design arguments are sort of designed from this perspective, and they're focused on the question of God's existence and whether there's evidence for God's existence within the realm of our use of human reason. Now, when we look at these arguments, my main focus here is to try to think about and to try to get us to consider really how effective it is to approach religious questions from a philosophical point of view. And what I mean by that is from a point of view that looks at the role of rational argument as something that decides these questions. And I think we might want to hesitate before we say that rational argument is sort of useless in the question of religion and what religious truth is all about. I think that would be a mistaken thing to say. We can't simply dispense with rational arguments. It's just so important to us and our lives and how we figure things out. However, I think when we look through these arguments, perhaps one of the things that we'll want to conclude and think about is whether there is something that is key to religious experience that cannot be approached by means of rational argument. And the question of the truth or the falsity of religious experience, or what kind of thing religion is, it may be that we'll want to say that rational argument doesn't really give us the keys to figure out what religious experience is all about. Typically, like I said, the philosophy of religion has sort of looked at classic, what are called philosophical proofs for God's existence, and looked at the arguments for and against these proofs. And in that way, it's sort of a very limited perspective on religion and what the truth about religion is for human experience. And what I mean by that is, other people like Karl Marx have looked at religion sociologically, and Freud has looked at religion psychology, and so on. And there are different sort of perspectives that you could take to try to understand religion, even sort of from within social science. But the philosophical perspective, insofar as it's relied on the proofs, does seem to be a somewhat limited perspective. So let's see if we can talk about it and figure out what these arguments are supposed to show, and why, to what extent you might want to say that they're successful, to what extent you might want to say they are unsuccessful. Bear in mind, when you look at them, that you have to be very careful here that you don't confuse your assent or disagreement with one of these arguments with your own perspective on whether you are a religious person who believes in God's existence, or somebody who is a self-described atheist who doesn't. It may be that you believe in God's existence but still don't find the cosmological argument or the design argument particularly persuasive. In other words, your belief may rest on other grounds. If you're an atheist or somebody who is an agnostic, that is, somebody who neither believes nor doesn't believe, obviously you won't find these arguments especially convincing, the cosmological and the design arguments. That is, you won't sort of be convinced by these arguments. However, you may still say that to an extent they're irrelevant. In other words, just because these arguments don't work, that's not really where all the important sort of material about religion and its role in human life really lies. In other words, it may not be central to religion. For example, Karl Marx was somebody who was also a very severe critic of religion, but for other reasons, not because of his disbelief of the cosmological and the design arguments, for example, but because of the social role that he believed religion played. So let's get into these arguments more closely, but to start off, let's talk about some preliminary definitions. Natural theology, like I said, is the way that we approach religion within the discipline of philosophy. And like I said, we may want to say that it's a sort of very narrow, a very limited perspective on religion. Officially, natural theology brackets all sorts of post-natural evidence. What does that mean? Well, it means things like the belief in the divine origin of certain texts. And of course, major religions, at least the major monotheistic religions, claim to have a text that is divinely inspired, whether that's the Quran, whether that's the Torah, or the Christian Bible. To have a text that's divinely inspired means, in other words, that you take what is written in this text in a different way. It has a different status from every other ordinary, everyday text. It's based on some supernatural warrant that makes everything in this text automatically true, and true in a way that is different from truth that you can find in other texts. That's one of the things that I'm talking about that natural theology brackets. In other words, from the point of view of natural theology, there are no sacred texts. There is nothing that cannot be weighed in terms of its evidence and in terms of arguments for and against. There is no sacred text. There are also no such thing, of course, as miracles. In other words, anything that sort of claims a supernatural status, we have to weigh as though it were subject to evidence and interpretation and so on. So as people generally say, natural theology doesn't sort of take things on faith, right? So accepting something just because you believe that it has a supernatural warrant and we shouldn't put it in question, natural theology brackets that perspective. Now I want us to be careful here, and we have to be clear. It does that not because it says, and there's no implicit claim here that sacred texts or belief in those texts is simply false. All that we're doing is rather bracketing that claim and saying, well, let's just see what we can prove from within the scheme of natural theology. Let's just see what natural theology can tell us about God's existence and religion. Can we get there from within natural theology? So it doesn't bracket other claims relying on faith, miracles and so on. It doesn't bracket those claims because it says, well, those are automatically false and useless and worthless as proofs. It simply wants to say, let's see what, starting from simply our natural ability to argue and use our powers of reason based on our observation of the world around us, what can we conclude about God's existence and reason? Okay, so in philosophy, all ways of finding out about God, of approaching the divine, other than through rational argument, are bracketed. Right? They're placed under brackets. Not that they're thrown away as false or useless. They're bracketed. That they're just not. They don't have any consideration within philosophical arguments. Before we get on to look at the proofs, let's just take a look at the different perspectives that one can take on the existence of God. And I'm just going to run through this questionnaire that's on page 311 of the text. Now, the first claim states that for someone's belief in God to be rational, he or she must have objective evidence supporting this claim. You may agree or disagree with that. If you agree with that claim, then that would make you what's called an evidentialist. In other words, you believe that evidence is key to religious belief. In other words, whether you can say, well, I'm a believer, and here are the reasons why I believe that one should be a believer. These are the reasons why I believe that God exists, or that religion has some warrant, has some truth. If you deny that claim, then you would be you would be a non-evidentialist. No, that you would agree with that claim if you were, say, somebody who is an atheist who says, yes, it's true, however, there is no objective evidence. We'll get to that. If you disagree, then you would be a non-evidentialist. In other words, you don't believe that objective evidence is key to a belief being rational, to belief in God being rational. What kind of things would be objective evidence? Well, scientifically supported claims, or claims that one can deduce through rational argument. Like, as we'll see, the cosmological argument might be a claim to provide objective evidence. Number 2. It is possible to demonstrate the existence of God through rational, objective arguments. Okay? If you believe that that's true, if you agree with that claim, then you are an evidentialist, but more specifically, you are a theistic evidentialist, meaning that you believe that you need objective evidence, and furthermore, you make the further claim that's not stated in the first one. You make the further claim that such objective evidence actually does exist. So God's existence can be demonstrated through rational evidence, through rational arguments and evidence. Number 3, objective evidence cannot decide the God issue, but there are practical and subjective reasons for believing in God. This would make you a non-evidentialist theist. Okay? In other words, you don't believe that objective evidence is crucial. However, you do believe that there are other reasons for that warrant belief in God's existence. Okay, so those reasons might be practical or subjective reasons. And in the text, there's a section on pragmatism and the pragmatic theory of belief that's associated with a philosopher called William James. And one of the things that James argued is that there's a good argument for, or there are good grounds for religious belief based on the practical difference that it makes to one's life to be a believer. So he doesn't believe it's based on objective evidence, but it's more of a sort of practical consequence of believing and the difference it makes in how one lives. So that's James' argument. That would be a non-evidentialist argument. In other words, it's not based on objective evidence that one can provide to others. It's a practical or a subjective reason. Number 4 states that belief in God must be based on faith alone and cannot be justified either by objective or by subjective reasons. That's the fideist position, what's called the fideist position. And this is a form of non-evidential theism, but it's a form that focuses on the relationship of faith. And there's a very interesting philosophical tradition that does take that perspective. Søren Kierkegaard, a very well-known Danish philosopher, is somebody who very much endorses that perspective and gives his own very unique grounds in support of that position. And there's something very important, I think, about that position, that it suggests whatever evidence we have, it's never going to be sufficient to warrant the jump to a belief. There's always the need for a further, what's called a leap of faith, some sense of faith that allows one to close the gap between the evidence one has and belief itself. So a lot of people argue that that's in fact crucial to religious belief, that whatever the evidence is, there still needs to be something else, a faith that supplements the evidence and allows one to believe in spite of whatever the actual evidence is that enables one to believe. Number 5, God exists, is obviously the statement of theism. Number 6, God does not exist, would be the statement of atheism, which is of course in direct contradiction to theism. The seventh claim is that we should not refuse to believe either that God exists or that God does not exist, and that is the statement of agnosticism, sometimes described as fence-sitting, more charitably described as refusing to believe until there is sufficient evidence for swaying one way or the other. A lot of agnostics would say that given our human condition, there's simply no way we can have the evidence that we require to believe or not to believe. And in that condition, the rational thing to do is simply to withhold belief. There's nothing that can push us to either believe or to disbelieve. So both the theists and the atheists mistakenly take the jump towards believing or not believing, but simply is not warranted. We cannot justifiably take either position according to the agnostics. So this gives us a nice summary of what some of the positions are that we could take here, and it gives us an idea of the extent of the disagreements. Even among people who are religious believers, there are many different grounds for belief. And of course the same holds for forms of non-belief. There are many different ways of upholding non-belief. Some people who are non-believers are evidentialists and would say, well, there isn't the objective evidence to support belief in God's existence. Other non-religious people would sort of place their claim in terms of a lack of practical or subjective reasons. Some people might say that there are very practical problems or very practical sort of disadvantages that stem from believing. So you could go either way in this, but it gives us a sense of what the extent of the different positions are, and that's a good platform from which to begin. So let's take a look at the proofs. Now the cosmological argument we can state in the form of a traditional argument here from page 314 of the textbook. We can state it like this. The first claim tells us that the world contains things whose existence depends upon some cause. That's straightforward. There are things that we see around us which would not exist unless they were caused to exist in the way that they exist by something else. So perhaps everything that we see around us, its existence depends upon some cause. The second claim suggests that everything that exists is either uncaused or caused to exist by another. And that seems to be exhaustive, meaning that if you exist, the property existence can be ascribed to a particular thing, it falls into one of these two boxes. It falls either into the class of things, if there is such a class, the class of things that are uncaused, or it falls into the box of things that are caused to exist by another. In other words, if you're not caused to exist by something else, then you must necessarily be uncaused, right? You must necessarily be a self-causing thing, right? Uncaused to exist by something else. So that's the premise, the second premise. It tells us there are only two options. You're either uncaused or caused to exist by another. In other words, brought into existence by the operation of something else. The statement number 3 tells us that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. Infinite meaning going back in a never-ending way, or extending it in a never-ending way, never finishing. In other words, there's no end point to it. Regress meaning going backwards. So an infinite regress meaning a never-ending chain going back into the past. Premise 3 tells us that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. In other words, there cannot be an infinite, a never-ending chain of causes extending into the past. Premise 4 tells us, and this is supposed to follow from Premise 3, that there must be an uncaused first cause. In other words, if we can't have a never-ending series of causes going into the past, there must have been a first cause that set the chain in motion. In other words, there must have been something which was a first cause. And of course, by definition, and this takes us back to premise number 2, by definition, if something is a first cause, it's not caused to exist by something else, therefore it must be uncaused. Now, premise 5 tells us that an uncaused first cause is in part at least, what we mean by God. Premise number 6 concludes, therefore God exists, based on this argument. Okay, the basic idea, and it's a little bit, well, it's a little bit abstract, isn't it, when we look at it, and not exactly enlightening. The basic idea behind the argument is to tell us that there must have been some beginning of the world, that the world must have begun at some point. And the only way of making sense of that beginning is by suggesting that there was a first cause, something which wasn't itself brought into existence, but set the whole thing in motion. And that first cause, it suggests, has to be something which is powerful enough to create the universe, so that has to be God. Okay? So the cosmological argument tells us that the beginning of the universe, there has to be a beginning, and the beginning has to be God. So, we could put that as follows. The existence of the universe, according to the cosmological argument, requires an explanation, right? It doesn't explain itself, it requires some explanation of why the universe and our world within it exists. And an active creation of the universe by a being outside of the universe. Now that active creation is generally assumed to be God. Is that explanation? Okay? The existence of the universe requires an explanation, and by suggesting that there is a being sort of outside of, independent of the universe, who actively creates that universe, is what enables us to have that explanation. Now, a number of people have suggested that there are weaknesses with the cosmological arguments, and we can generally, I think, summarize those weaknesses. There are three main things which seem to go wrong with the argument, or I should say, which seem to be serious problems for the cosmological argument. And the first point takes us back to premise 3. And it asks simply, why can't there be an infinite regress of causes? And in addition, why does a first cause make any more sense? Now the idea here is, as it was said, because we can't have an infinite regress of causes, the argument says, well, therefore we need a first cause that sort of starts the process and actually is the origin, the creation of the universe. Now, you might well say, and this was the position of a philosopher that we've looked at previously, Immanuel Kant, you might well say that neither of these positions really make a good deal of sense. In other words, the idea of an infinite regress of causes we don't really find that attractive. We can't really make sense of the idea of a never-ending series of causes going back into the past, so that the universe in fact never had a beginning at all. It would just be sort of an infinite series of causes in the past. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to us. We can't make sense of that claim. But can we make any more sense of the idea that there is a first cause? And it may be that that's problematic as well, and problematic because, of course, the first thing that comes into our mind, and we'll get to that in a second, is who caused this first cause. In other words, why is that exempt from the principle that everything is caused by something else? So it may be that neither of these options really are attractive and make any great deal of sense. And one thing that Kant suggested here was that maybe this is where, remember he talks about the limits of our reason. Maybe this is one of the areas, one of the cases where our ability to reason has reached its limits, and we just can't use our powers of rational argument to figure this one out. That neither of the options are really enable us to get out of the conundrum and to solve the problem. That both of them sort of conjure up more problems than they provide, anything in the sense of a satisfactory solution. So this may be one of those cases, and Kant may be right here that the cosmological argument is a case of reason simply going beyond the bounds of what it can rationally accomplish. Now the second point, the second weakness states, if everything needs a cause, then by definition God himself needs a cause also to explain his existence. Therefore the argument does not really explain anything. That's the point that I was talking about above with the problem of a first cause. In other words, there's a philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, who said, we can't sort of endorse the idea of everything being caused and then sort of leave it behind when it suits us. If the universe is composed of things that are caused by other things, then we really have to extend that to God as well, and we have to explain his existence in terms of something that caused God to exist. So, because we don't have that here, the idea of God is really not any kind of an explanation at all. It's simply an attempt to sort of escape from the need to give an explanation. And according to Schopenhauer, that's what positing God as a first cause does in the case of this particular argument. Now, the third argument suggests that even if it were true that the universe needs a first cause, the argument does not necessarily prove that this first cause must be God, or that it must have the attributes that we associate with God. Now, the point here that's being made, and I think this is this strikes me as making sense, making a good deal of sense, and really hard to argue with this point. All that we've proved by means of the cosmological arguments is that the universe, even if that is to say, even if the cosmological argument is true, all that we've proved is that the universe needs a first cause. Now, we haven't necessarily proved that this first cause must be something like God in the sense of the attributes that we associate with the idea of God. And of course, that will depend on the religious traditions that we belong to, and the religious sources that we use to understand the way God works and God's relation with human beings. Now, all that we've proved with this argument is that there must be a first cause. It does not tell us that God in the sense of the God that, if we're religious people, we claim to know, that God exists. In fact, it may be all kinds of assumptions may be compatible with the idea of a first cause. It doesn't have to have the qualities, or that first cause need not have the qualities that we associate with God. Whether we think of that as a sort of a pantheistic idea of God completely foreign to our own, or whether we think of that as a malevolent deity rather than a benevolent one who is interested in human beings and their welfare. There are many different ways that can go. All that is being suggested here is that there is a very clear limit to what the argument can in fact prove. Now, the argument from contingency is a later version of the cosmological argument. It's really a slight modification of the cosmological argument, and it relies not upon the idea of a cause, which was what characterized it in its original form, and Thomas Aquinas is the philosopher very important in the Catholic tradition, who is largely responsible, in fact, for the form of the cosmological argument that we know of. The argument from contingency builds on the idea of what's called the principle of sufficient reason, shortened in shortened form, usually expressed as PSR. And this principle comes from a philosopher called Leibniz, who originally came up with the idea. And what lies behind it is the idea that the universe, like everything else, needs a sufficient explanation of why it exists, and which explains why it is the way that it is. In other words, if it's contingent, then something must explain why it is like it is. This, again, it sounds sort of like a confusing idea. The basic premise behind it is quite simple, and it suggests that if something isn't necessarily the way that it is, so if it's not that way by necessity, and it couldn't possibly be otherwise, that's what makes something contingent, that it could have taken a different form. And then the argument simply says, well, the fact that something takes the form that it does, and in this case, of course, we're talking about the form that our world and our universe take, that the universe as a whole takes. If something is contingent, if it's not necessary, but it's one out of a number of sort of possible ways in which we can envision the universe existing, then it's contingent. Something that is contingent needs a explanation, it needs another principle behind it to explain to us why it takes this particular form rather than another particular form. And that's the idea that's expressed in the principle of sufficient reason. That what we're looking for is a sufficient explanation of why the universe is why it exists and why it takes the specific form that it does in fact take. A lot of critics of the argument from contingency argue that this principle, what goes wrong with the argument from contingency, is that it only applies to things within the world of our experience, and it can't apply to the world as a whole. You'll notice that that's an argument that in fact goes back to Immanuel Kant, who argued that one of the ways that we go wrong in our reasoning is to extend ideas that only hold of things within the world of our experience and try to apply them to our world as a whole. And when we try to do that, that's when we go wrong. Kant was a big believer in that idea. And critics of the argument from contingency argues that this is what we're trying to do here. In other words, it makes sense within the world of our experience to apply the principle of sufficient reason, PSR, and to say that if something is contingent, then there must be something that sufficiently explains why it took the form that it did. However, when we try to apply that to the world as a whole, problems arise. That there's no justification for us saying just because it applies to everything that we come across in experience, it has to apply to the world as a whole. Now, philosopher Bertrand Russell is most famous for making this criticism of the argument, not just about this argument, but there are a lot of what are called fallacies or sort of problems of reasoning that take this form. And the way that Russell expressed the problem in this sort of argument was as follows. Let's consider if we try to extend something that applies to a whole set of things that we're familiar with, and then try to apply the same principle to the set as a whole, or the group as a whole. So, for example, we know full well from experience, it's true of everything that happens within our world, that every human being has a mother, okay? A biological mother. Not necessarily a social mother, of course, but that's a different thing. We're talking about a biological mother. Now, suppose you said, therefore, the entire collection of human beings has a mother. In other words, what applies to each individual, then you apply to the group as a whole and say, can we extend this principle to the group as a whole? Well, obviously, no, you can't. It doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous to say that the entire collection of human beings has a mother. Now, critics of the argument from contingency argue that that's what's going on with this argument, that we're saying that what applies to every item that we experience in the world, that the principle of sufficient reason, in other words, we must seek an explanation for it, that we should apply that to the world as a whole. And they argue that what goes wrong there is exactly the same thing. That is, critics of the argument argue that what goes wrong is exactly the same thing as goes wrong when we extend from every human being has a mother to therefore the entire collection of human beings has a mother. We end up with what we call a logical fallacy. In other words, it seems like we're reasoning and we're applying our thinking logically, but in fact we're falling into a trap of our logic. We're falling into a trap that our thinking leads us into unless we're very careful. And that's what critics of the argument from contingency say is going wrong with this particular argument. Now let's shift focus from the cosmological arguments and let's talk about the design argument. The design argument, I think we can say very safely, is probably the most well-known, the most popular, and the most easy to grasp of the so-called philosophical proofs for God's existence. This one is just more concrete and more easy for us to get our heads around. It's probably the most popular, and a lot of people, if they thought about it, would probably say, yes, I find the design argument intuitively plausible. Now, of course, there's another perspective which clashes very strongly with the design argument, and we're going to look in depth at that perspective this week. And that, of course, is the argument of evolution, which clashes with the design argument because it suggests we don't need the premise of design and a designer to explain the universe and to explain the level of complexity, order, and organization in the universe. Therefore, the design argument fails. So, in the 19th century, when Charles Darwin comes up with or first, let's say, systematizes and writes down in a very systematic form the theory of evolution with which he's identified, we get a sort of scientific response to the design argument for the first time. And so a lot of people sort of date the evolution argument as the point at which they would say the design argument ceases to be plausible. However, there's also a much older philosophical critique of the design argument, and that's what's featured in this chapter in the work of David Hume, and his critique of what goes wrong in the design argument. Now, he's as we saw before, Hume is a skeptic, so he's arguing that he's going to suggest that we can't figure out by, again, using our reason, we can't draw the kind of conclusions that the design argument or any philosophical proofs want to draw about God's existence. That doesn't mean that Hume's saying, he's certainly not saying that there are grounds for atheism. He's saying that our reason doesn't allow us to make those conclusions or to lead us to believe one way or the other. And again, for Hume, we may have cultural or social grounds, good cultural grounds for believing in God's existence or for not believing. However, reason can't help us decide the issue. That's what's decisive for Hume's perspective. So we'll have a look at some of his arguments here, and we'll go over generally the way that the design argument works and the different perspectives, its relation to science, and try and figure out its plausibility. If there's a figure who is most closely associated, especially in philosophy, with the design argument, it's William Paley. And Paley suggested this in this passage. He makes a well-known comparison between two things, and we'll look at how the argument works now and try to figure out what Paley is actually saying in this passage. Born in 1743 and died in 1805, William Paley, a British clergyman and philosopher. And this is his well-known analogy, which has been repeated and rewritten, and is a very famous passage. So what we'll do is we'll just read it through, and then we'll look at how the argument works, and look at some of Hume's criticisms of this way of making the argument. So here's the passage, and again it's on page 324 of the textbook. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how that stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I know to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. In other words, Paley is saying that would be an absurd thing to suppose in this case. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? In other words, why shouldn't we suppose for the watch that it had always been there, just as we do for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? Admissible meaning acceptable. For this reason and for no other, that is to say, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive, what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. This mechanism being observed, the inference, we think, is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers, that's to say a creator or creators, who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Now, let's just look at how the argument works, and then we'll draw some general conclusions about the design argument. And this is what philosophers call an argument by analogy. And an argument by analogy works by comparing two things. And it establishes a relation between two things. And the success of the argument depends upon how close and how successful the analogy drawn between those two things is. Now, the two things that Paley wants to suggest a relationship between is a watch and the universe. Okay? And he wants to suggest that what we would say about the watch, in other words, that we would come across it and we would say, well, it didn't get there by chance, it wasn't, it hasn't been there for forever, it didn't just sort of emerge there by accident. It must have been created by someone. There must have been what Paley calls an artificer, somebody who constructs the watch, an intelligent mind that creates it and that put it there. And he's suggesting that that's exactly what we have to conclude when we look at the universe as well. It suggests, and the argument by analogy works here by suggesting that, like a watch, the universe exhibits such a complex design that it could only have been the creation of an intelligent will. Okay? Now, just one limitation we have to make about the design argument. What it attempts to show is that the existence of a designer is the most probable explanation of the order in the universe. And that's all we can really show by this argument from analogy. Okay? It's not supposed to be what we would call a knockdown proof, that if you accept the argument then that's the end of the matter and it's sort of true by definition, or it's absolutely true. To say it's the most probable means it suggests that this is the most convincing explanation of what we see around us. It's not what we would call a watertight proof, but to say it's the most probable may mean that it's an explanation that just seems to fit the evidence so well that no other explanation would really looks convincing in relation to it. So that's what the design argument wants to show. Relation, the analogy between the watch and the universe is key. Okay, so the key premise is that if you found a watch, you would have to imagine that it was designed by an intelligent mind, right? It shows that it's a complex means to achieve a particular intelligent goal or a particular intelligent end. In the case of a watch, of course, that's telling the time. Now, we're supposed to then say, well, Paley wants us to say, well, look around at the universe, at the complexity of design, at the way, for example, everything seems to fit together. Everything seems to be interlinked, especially in our world. Everything seems to be linked together to make it possible for life to exist. From the presence of oxygen and water, and the sort of very fragile atmosphere, everything seems to have come together to make it possible for life to exist. Now, Paley wants to say that that when we look at that, we'd see the same level of complexity and intricate design as we would see in a watch, and therefore we would have to conclude that only an intelligent mind could have designed things this way. It couldn't possibly have always been this way or have arisen by non-intelligent processes. And that claim, of course, is precisely, as we'll see shortly, what the Darwin view wants to question. Now, there's a problem here even before we get to the questioning of whether we have to infer an intelligent mind from the sort of order and structure of the universe. There's another issue we need to take up with the design argument, and that's the question of what we can really and genuinely infer about God, even if the design argument is successful. In other words, let's just suppose for a minute, not that we accept it, but let's just suppose for a minute that the design argument is successful, and that it shows us convincing reasons for believing that there must have been a designer, and therefore excuse me, that the universe must have a creator, and therefore that God must exist. What can we infer about God even if that argument is successful? Now, here's where we come back to our old friend David Hume, and he suggested that even here there's very little that the argument, relying on, again, our powers of reason, using an argument by analogy, there's very little that we can genuinely infer, even if the argument is successful. He suggests that the argument would require us to uphold the following conclusions, and this is on page 328 to 29 of the textbook. And of all of these, of course, as we'll see, run contrary to what we usually want to say about God's existence if it's held that God is true, if it's held that God truly exists. In other words, for people who are theists, these things are usually held to be true about God. Hume says we can't get there from the design argument. Here are the three things. Firstly, he says we would have to conclude that God is not infinite if the design argument is true, for a finite effect only requires a finite cause. What is the finite effect? Obviously, human life and the existence of the world. And everything in the world, of course, being finite, exists in time and then disappears and decays. We would have to assume that God is finite as well. And equally, an interesting thing here is that an equally plausible explanation, or an explanation that would explain the evidence equally well, is if we said, as a sort of experiment, aliens created our solar system, and then sort of let it run and are observing the effects from some sort of faraway galaxy. How is that less plausible according to the design argument than the argument for God? In fact, the creator may not even be God if the design argument is true. It could be an alien life form. All that we can conclude here, and this is the issue that I'm trying to draw out, our reason doesn't allow us to get to the conclusions about God that we want to get to from the design argument. And that's why Hume's argument, I think, is very important and sort of leads us onto some very serious issues with this proof, and also, I think, in the idea of philosophical proofs in general. We'll come back to that. So anyway, there's the first point: God is not infinite. The second thing is God is not perfect. One could well suggest that there are, in fact, many design faults with the world as we know it. Obviously, we can all imagine cases where things could have been designed better in our own lives and our own bodies, for example. Think how much better it would be if our organisms weren't susceptible to cancer, if they weren't susceptible to various viruses. Think how much easier it would be if childbirth didn't involve considerable pain. Of course, now there are drugs that sort of make it easier, but still, it's certainly not a pleasant process, and the whole sort of process of pregnancy itself is one that is very taxing. So, we can suggest that there are many design faults with the world as we know it. So, what does that suggest? It suggests a designer who is not perfect. So we have to, not only do we have to do away with the idea of infinity, we have to do away with the idea of perfection. Thirdly, we would have to say that God is not perfectly intelligent, since all the products of human intelligence, including, of course, watches, emerge through trial and error. Okay? So we would have to assume that, in other words, if it's based on our knowledge of things like watches that are the products of an intelligent mind, we know that those things are produced through sort of trying something and failing and producing a better model. We would have to assume, if that's what the argument is based on, that God did that too. In other words, that God created worlds and they were, so messed up they just didn't work. And eventually he got to the stage where, there's a universe that sort of actually seems to do okay. Eventually, perhaps, again, another sort of hypothesis, perhaps ours is another sort of potentially failed world, and it's going to be annihilated, and then God will make an effort to produce a better one. So that there are all sorts of assumptions that we can't, these the argument draws us towards, and then the assumptions that the argument makes it unable for us to make. Okay, so the conclusion here, and what Hume wants to draw out, is that using the design argument, even if it's true, we can't get to an idea of God that the design argument wants us to get towards. In other words, it doesn't suggest a creator who's infinite, perfect, and perfectly intelligent. In fact, it suggests a creator that's far from any of those things, according to Hume's critique of the argument. Now, when we look at this issue of what can be proved by the design argument, and I think the same would hold true of all of the philosophical proofs for the existence of God, the question really that they pose for us is, does it suggest the limits of natural theology? Does it suggest that, in other words, natural theology, remember the perspective from which philosophy looks at religion simply by using our powers of religion, argument, and observation. Is there a limit to using that perspective as a way of approaching what religion is all about? How much can our powers of reason and argument help us to understand religion and religious experience? And what you conclude, if you do agree that there are really limits on what natural theology can tell us, you can either conclude, firstly, that reason and argument as we understand them through philosophy are insufficient for making sense of religion and religious experience, or perhaps you can conclude that religious experience is not the type of thing that can be understood with reason and argument, and you might suggest that that's because it's a purely non-rational form of experience, or you might suggest that it appeals to perhaps a form of intuition, or a way of experiencing things that is not susceptible to, not influenced by our powers of reason and argument. But I think it does make sense to say that here we become aware, as Kant talked about, of the limits of what our reason can tell us, and the limits of what we can find out by using our natural powers of reasoning. Let's take a look at the four perspectives that are distinguished in the textbook. The four perspectives on the relation between science and religion. And generally we can sort of distinguish four different models, and again this leading us into the Darwinian idea, which is an idea based on the procedures and the methods of science, and the relation between the scientific view of the world and religious understanding. So these four different perspectives are, firstly, what's called the adversarial model, and this suggests that religion and science are really in conflict. They try to explain the same thing, and they explain the same thing in different and incompatible ways. Now that's definitely true of the design argument and Darwinian theory. In other words, the design argument and Darwin's theory both try to explain the complexity and account for the complexity of the universe. The design argument tries to do that by suggesting that there has to be a designer, and Darwin tries to do that by suggesting that complexity can arise through sort of sub-level non-intelligent processes. So the adversarial model suggests that there's a conflict. Territorialism is the idea that the religion and science belong to different, as the term suggests, they belong to different territories, different regions. If you agree with Descartes about mental substance and a completely different sort of substance, an extended substance, if you believe with Descartes that there are different substances in the world, territorialism makes a lot of sense. To say that one region, perhaps the region of ourselves as mental substances, is the realm that can be investigated by religion and is immune to the understanding of science, whereas the realm of extended substances is what can be approached by using scientific terms. That makes sense. But if you're not a follower of Descartes, a Cartesian, if you don't go with that perspective, then territorialism isn't very appealing, and in fact it doesn't, outside of that perspective, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. What's probably more plausible is what's called perspectivalism. And perspectivalism is the idea that religion and science are two different perspectives on the same thing. They both look at the world, but they look at it from different ways. You could say very sort of broadly and simply, science wants to explain the world, and religion wants to tell us about the sort of moral qualities or the moral nature of the world. As Galileo put it, science wants to explain the heavens, religion wants to tell us how to get to heaven. So they both explain the same thing, but explain it in different ways from different perspectives. So they're not in conflict. They're simply different ways of looking at the same thing, different perspectives on the same area of life, and look at it from either a natural scientific or perhaps a religious moral perspective. And the fourth is harmonizers, and harmonizers more strongly than perspectivalism. Harmonizers say that the findings that we get in science harmonize with what religion tells us about the world. In other words, they're not just sort of compatible, as perspectivalism says. It's not just that they're compatible, but they mutually support one another, and one reinforces the other. So the more that we know about the world from a scientific perspective reinforces what religion tells us about a creator and everything else. So what might be the perspective of a harmonizer, or the what might support the viewpoints of a harmonizer? Well, there are a lot of findings in especially theoretical physics that have sort of shown the complexity of existence, and the very minuscule chance of the universe developing in the specific way that it did to make it one that would be capable of sustaining life. A lot of people who are physicists have been attracted by the view that once you understand the sort of low chance of the world happening and sort of taking the course that it did, that provides a lot of corroboration for the religious perspective that there had to be an external infinite source to guarantee the universe's sort of development. So those perspectives are outlined in the chapter, and they're each four different ways of looking at the relation between religion and science. We should note that it's often assumed that they're in conflict, but they're not necessarily in conflict. It's only the adversarial model within which they are in conflict. There are a lot of other ways of looking at it, and like I said, I think perspectivalism is probably the most popular, from which they're not in conflict, but in fact they can coexist. They're compatible with one another. Now, finally, and we'll deal more with this in this week's material, the perspective of evolution is often, an evolutionary theory is often associated with Charles Darwin, who was the first person to really put it into a precise and systematic form. It's an explanation for our purposes. What's important, at least, is that it's an explanation for the order and complexity of the universe that doesn't rest on the hypothesis, the idea of a designer. So it's a way of explaining the complexity, the appearance of design in our universe without positing the idea, without suggesting the idea of a designer. So that's what a lot of people found attractive about Darwin's theory, that it explains how we could get from a much sort of simpler condition to one of very complex design without having to posit that an intelligent mind was guiding the process. And key to Darwin's theory, and what puts it in conflict with the design argument, he argued that it's random variations, in other words, random changes occurring in a species over time. And nowadays, now that sort of after genetic biology, these random variations are seen as occurring at the level of our genes. In other words, those variations are genetic variations. Darwin argued that those random variations, they occur in individuals in the species, and they occur in conditions of relative scarcity. In other words, relative scarcity meaning we're in competition for food and resources. So those conditions of relative scarcity produce what's called a struggle for survival. Now, if there are these random variations, then some of those variations will be advantageous in the course of that struggle, in the course of that struggle under conditions of scarcity. In other words, if you happen to have a genetic mutation, and again, it's something that for Darwin occurs in an entirely random way. They're random mutations. But suppose you have a mutation that, say, increases your vision by 15%. That may be significant enough to give you a greater chance of survival over time than other members of the species to which you belong. And it may be that that trait will be passed on. In other words, that sort of gain, 15% greater vision, will be passed on to your kin and so on. So that's what produces change. So over time, this process, and it's a process of natural selection. In other words, it's not guided, but it's produced by the interaction of the environment and these random variations. And that's really what natural selection is. It's random variations occurring in an environment of relative scarcity. This process produces organisms that are highly suited to their environment. Organisms which exhibit precisely that degree of complexity that the design argument appeals to when it looks at the world and says, well, this must have been the result of an intelligent mind. So, very, very simply, that's the conflict, the disagreement between the perspective, the evolution perspective, and the design argument. And they're both explaining the same thing, but explaining them in completely different ways. So we'll try and look a little bit more closely at that contrast in this week's material when we go through some of the tasks.